Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. Today, I bring you episode 59, which will explore the final major group of land plants in the kingdom Plantae. These are the Angiosperms, or the flowering plants. So first, to recap how I've gotten here, I began this series by talking about the common ancestor of all the land plants, which came from the lineage of green algae. The first true land plants to emerge were small, non-vascular growths of photosynthetic tissue, like the liverworts, the mosses, and the hornworts. When the evolution of vascular tissue created a major divergence in the land plant clade, the first lineages to branch off were the lycophytes and the ferns, all plants that still use spores to reproduce. 319 million years ago, there was a big genetic mutation that gave rise to the seed and the divergence of the seed plants. The first of these seed plants were the Gymnosperms, which I talked about in the previous episode. Today, I'll be exploring the rest of the seed plants, which are the Magnoliaphytes, the Angiosperms, the flowering plants. The mutation that led to the emergence of seed plants would create a lineage of vegetation that would grow to dominate much of the world, for a time. For more than 100 million years, the Gymnosperms were the only seed plants. They diversified into lineages of huge trees, and they pushed out the lycophyte trees and the massive ferns from the tropics, and usurped from them the title of dominant tree-form plant. They would radiate outwards and adapt to new environments, to harsher environments, with drier air and thinner soil and colder temperatures. The Gymnosperm party, however, would not last forever. By around 250 million years ago, the Gymnosperm ancestors of the Angiosperms were beginning to diverge. Around 190 million years ago, closer to 192 million to be more precise, there was another major genetic mutation that appeared. A whole genome duplication event that would give rise to the first truly flowering plants. This mutation greatly altered the seeds, differentiating them from their gymnosperm cousins. These mutations enabled the emergence of a reproductive strategy that involves a double fertilization. 2 sperm are released, and one fertilizes the egg, like the gymnosperm cousins, while the other fertilizes a central polar nuclei and forms a triploid cell. The fertilized egg will grow to fill the inside of the ovary, becoming an embryo, while that triploid cell will produce a new structure called an endosperm. The endosperm is a tissue that grows within the seed, giving the embryo nutrients. The endosperm is basically a powerful food storage organ for the young embryo. And this had major implications for angiosperm evolution, but I'll talk about that more later on. This first mutation event also led to a rapid emergence of flowers in the fossil record. So rapid, in fact, that early biologists in the 19th century could not explain how flowers came to be so widespread so suddenly. Since then, the fossil record has been greatly fleshed out, and the story of the evolution of angiosperms has been largely revealed. About 30 million years after that, around 160 million years ago, there was another mutation event that further refined the properties of the emergent flowers, and created a lineage of flowering plants that would outcompete all of the other primitive angiosperms. Alright, so just to retouch on this timeline, 190 million years ago, the first flowering plants emerged, the first true flowers, and 160 million years ago, there was another major mutation that created a lineage of the flowering plants that outcompeted virtually all the rest, and became the ancestor to virtually all of the flowering plants that exist today. Some of the first of these flowering plants to emerge were the Ambarella, a group that's so primitive that their woody vascular tissue has the tracheid structures, but it doesn't have the vessel element structures that exist in virtually every other species of flowering plant. The Ambarella typically grow as a woody bush or a small tree, typically no more than 8 meters, or 25 feet tall. It grows wide, leathery leaves that get up to 10 centimeters long. They have really weird-looking flowers, which grow layers of spirally arranged, flesh-colored, white-tipped flower petals. Another group of flowering plants are the Nymphaeas, which are aquatic plants with herbaceous tissues and broad leaves. They include genera like Nymphaea, the water lilies, and Victoria, which look like weird, super huge water lilies, but with entirely round leaves. The leaves of these plants form really wide circles bordered by an upturned lip of tissue, so as to keep water off of the main part of the leaf itself. What's really neat about these things is that the leaf itself is extremely fragile and it's easily torn and punctured, but because the leaves are so wide, they're able to spread out the weight of a large object. These Victoria leaves can hold around 70 pounds before they actually sink. That's a pretty impressive feat of evolutionary engineering. Another genus in the Nymphaeas are the Newfar, which have weird, small little flowers. The sepals of the Newfar plants are relatively large compared to the flower petals, and they grow in a large bowl shape around the flower. And as the fruits of the Newfar are grown from the flower, the fruit develops inside of this tiny little cup or bowl created by the sepal petals. It's a natural bowl of fruit. A third group of flowering plants, again one of the oldest lineages that were among the first to diverge, are the Austrobaliales, which are a small order of about 100 species of woody plants. A well-known genus within this order is Elysium, which is a clade including woody shrubs and trees that don't lose their leaves in the fall. They are generally shade-tolerant and shade-preferring plants, which have flowers that come in all shades of red: pink, orange, red-orange, bright red, blood red, scarlet, maroon, you name it. The red-colored flowers of these Elysium plants, as well as their leaves, they're not just bright and vivid, but they also emit a very strong fragrance. All of these early flowering plants were some of the first lineages to diverge from the rest of the Angiosperms, and thus they're some of the most distantly related, genetically, to all of the other flowering plants. And of all of the flowering plants, they're the most closely related to the Gymnosperms. These groups compose the basal Angiosperms. Their genetics and physiology suggest that the flowering plants seem to have first originated in shade-covered areas with relatively high humidity, in soil that was both well-hydrated and well-aerated. And so it was from these humble beginnings that the flowering plants would emerge and diversify. During the time span from 100 million to 70 million years ago, these and other early angiosperms were outcompeting many of the lycophytes, the ferns, and the cycads, and taking over their habitats. Additionally, the ancient and powerful forests of conifers began to get pushed out of many habitats and replaced by closed canopy angiosperm trees. The KT extinction event 66 million years ago, which is the same extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs, was able to push the scales in favor of the angiosperms and against the gymnosperms. From this point onwards, angiosperms would adapt and radiate and diversify rapidly, with both woody and herbaceous species undergoing a kind of speciation explosion. From these early basal angiosperms emerged the lineages that would become the core angiosperms, which are also called the Mezeangiosperms. The Mezeangiosperms are 5 groups of flowering plants that all emerged relatively rapidly after the evolution of flowers. I mentioned earlier that a major mutation event involving a whole genome duplication happened around 190 million years ago, which gave rise to the flowering plants, and 160 million years ago there was another major mutation that gave rise to the ancestor of almost all modern-day flowering plants. That mutation led to the emergence of the first Mezeangiosperms, between 140 and 150 million years ago, and within 5 million years of their appearance, they had diversified into the Chlorinetales, the Magnolias, the Monocots, the Cerrado and the Eudicots. These are the 5 groups of Mezeangiosperms, which all appeared at roughly the same time in the fossil record, because of their divergences all happening in such a relatively quick time frame. I mean, 5 million years really isn't that long of a time when the angiosperms have been around for more than 100 million years, and seed plants have been around for more than 100 million years longer than that. The first divergence here would produce a lineage that would later diverge again into the Magnolias and the Chlorinetales. The Monocots were the next divergence, followed by the stem of the angiosperm lineages that would diverge into the Cerrado and the Eudicots. Alright, so I'll start with the Chlorinetales, which was one of the first Mezeangiosperm groups to appear, and yet, in the modern day, it has the second fewest extant species, at 77, spread between South and Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands of Oceania, Madagascar, and Central and South America. These Chlorinetales plants are generally small, with soft woody tissue or green herbaceous tissue, and weird flowers that lack flower petals. Some species even lack sepals. Of those species that do produce flowers, they are typically small and pale. These flower qualities mean the Chlorinetales have to rely almost entirely on scents and fragrances to attract pollinators instead of the visual cues that larger flowers can provide. The next group of Mezeangiosperms are the Magnolias, which are characteristic flowers. The flower petals grow with a complex branching vascular structure, and the plant itself gives rise to trimerous flowers that have 3 flower petals in each whorl. When you look at a magnoliad flower, it'll have 3 petals in each layered whorl of the flower, giving the whole structure a triangular aesthetic. Within the Magnolias, there are 4 orders: the Canellales, the Laurals, the Magnolias, and the Peperomia. So to begin with these, I'll start with the Canellales, which are a relatively small order with about 175 species. Some of these species are trees and shrubs in the family Winteraceae, while other species are in the family Canellaceae. These Canellaceae plants are typically small to medium-sized evergreen trees that grow in the tropics, producing bright red flowers and dark red fruits. What's kind of cool is that their leaves taste like pepper, and because of an organic chemical called N-cinnamyl-tryptamine and other chemicals like cinnamaldehydes, their berries and their bark smells strongly like cinnamon. Anyways, these Canellales are most closely related to the Peperomia. Peperomia are generally smaller and more accustomed to less tropical and more temperate climates. Within the Peperomia, there are 3 families. There's the Aristolochiaceae family, or the birthwort family, which has about 400 species characterized by strange flowers and the toxic chemical aristolochic acid. Not all of the species in the order express this toxin, but those who do will use it to discourage herbivores from eating them. The aristolochic acid doesn't just taste bad to your average grazing mammal or herbivorous insect, it's also known to cause cancer in mice, and it's associated with liver cancer and kidney damage in humans. Within the Aristolochiaceae family, there's a genus called Asarum, which are small herbaceous plants that grow a single pair of leaves each year. As angiosperms, they also express flowers, but I kind of think their flowers are ugly and creepy looking. The Asarum flowers are called little jugs, as are a lot of other Aristolochiaceae flowers, because the petals are partly fused together to create a deep cup or a jug shape, with the unfused tips of the petals tapering and twisting away like dead, rotting tentacles. The other 2 families within Peperomia include the Saururaceae, or the lizard tails, which tend to have white flowers, and the Peperomia, which includes almost all the species of plants that produce peppers. The Peperomia includes 5 genera, although 3 of these have an extremely small number of species. You have 6 species that belong to the Monocots, 3 species that belong to the Verhulia, and only 1 species belonging to the Zepelia. The other 2 groups are the Peperomia genus with 1,600 species and the Piper genus with 2,000 species. The Peperomia genus includes species with thick, fleshy leaves and short stems, typically existing as a tiny, compact epiphyte that grows in the forest canopy, on the branches of a tree or a larger plant. The Piper genus has pepper plants, like black pepper, which produce compounds like pepper, that's often used in human food as a spice or a kind of seasoning. Another order in the Magnolias are the Laurals, which is an older clade, extremely diverse, including more than 2,500 species of tropical and subtropical plants. Because this tropical lineage is relatively old and diverse, there isn't a single criteria or physical characteristic that unites them all. Some examples of species within the Laurals order include sassafras, avocado trees, and cinnamon trees. Where some of the Canella leaves have a cinnamon-like flavoring, the Laurals include a handful of trees in the genus Cinnamomum, which produce the real cinnamon that we harvest and use as flavoring. The last order in the Magnolias are the Magnoliales, which is a medium-sized order including 6 families. I won't go over all of them in detail, but some of them are the Annonaceae family, of tropical and subtropical trees, which produce a kind of weird, lumpy fruit. There's the Myristicacea family, which includes the Myristica fragrans species, known for producing nutmeg. There's also the Magnoliaceae family, which includes over 200 species whose flower petals are arranged in spirals instead of being arranged in layers of whorls. The Magnoliaceae has 2 subfamilies, one of which is the Liriodendroideae, or the tulip trees, and the other is the Magnolioideae, which includes all the species of magnolia flowers. Okay, I know it's taking me a while, but I'm working through the core Angiosperms one at a time, and now it's on to the next. You have the Magnolias and the Chlorinetales, which were the first to diverge and emerge, and then they were followed in the lineage by the divergence of the Monocots. The Monocots share features with their older cousins, like trimerous flowers and pollen grains with a single spore for the pollen tube cell to exit, but they also have several different features, including leaves that typically have parallel arrangements of straight, unbranching veins. But they also have several different features, including leaves that typically have parallel arrangements of straight, unbranching veins. These are called monocots because their seed embryos only have a single cotyledon, or a single developing leaf in the seed embryo. All of the other core angiosperms are dicots, or plants that possess 2 cotyledons, 2 developing leaves in their embryos. You might remember that I mentioned an order of core angiosperms called Eudicots. Well, these are a special kind of dicot that we'll talk about more in a few minutes. Where many of the other orders and families that I've talked about have relatively few species, like 1 species, or 3, or 6, or even a few thousand, the monocots have them all beat. The monocots encompass more than 60,000 species, including the orchids, which on their own are the largest single angiosperm family with over 20,000 species. There's another 10,000 species belonging to the family Poaceae, or the true grasses. So there's 10,000 species of grass. With such a huge number of species in the monocot order, it's not surprising that it's also hugely diverse. The monocots include not just the orchids and the grasses, but also palm trees, onions and garlic plants, pineapple plants, banana trees, ginger, rice, wheat, sugarcane, bamboo, as well as numerous flowers like lilies, amaryllis, tulips, and daffodils, And this is just scraping the surface, because there's many thousands of other monocot species. Besides having a single leaf in their seed embryo, the monocots also share a few other features. They don't produce vessel elements in their leaves. They use a species of fly as their pollinating insect. They have multiple carpels fused together into a single structure at the heart of their flowers. Perhaps the most evident and widely known trait of the monocots is that their vascular tissue on a cellular level is not neatly arranged. The columns of xylem and phloem in the monocots are scattered randomly throughout the stem and branches, whereas in the dicots, the vascular tissue is organized neatly into a ring along the inner edges of the stem. Many of the monocots are small and herbaceous plants, like your typical flowering bush plant or lawn weed, which means that they have a limited size because they can't engage in secondary growth. They can only produce soft herbaceous tissue, and there's only so much weight that soft tissue can support. However, a small minority of monocots, like the palm trees and the Mezeangiosperms banana trees, among others, are capable of an anomalous kind of secondary growth that allows them to reach the size of a dicot tree. The last divergence in the core Angiosperms, after the monocots had left and begun their own radiation, the last divergence produced the Cerrado and the Eudicots. The Cerrado order has one family, with one genus, and only 4 species, making it the smallest order in the Angiosperms. All of them are soft herbaceous marine plants with small flowers and no roots that grow in wetland environments like swamps, ponds, small streams, and slow-moving rivers. Due to this, they cannot endure drought, they cannot endure long periods of direct sunlight, and they cannot physically hold themselves up without an external solution of liquid water to keep them buoyant. Now, the Eudicots are the final group of Angiosperms, one of the 2 most recently emerged, and of all of the others, the Eudicots are the largest. Where the monocots have an impressive 60,000 species, the Eudicots have almost triple that, with something like 175,000 species. What this means is that the monocots make up about 20% of all of the angiosperm species, while the Eudicots make up about 75%. The remaining 5% of the angiosperms are all the other little groups and orders and families and species that I talked about in the first half of the episode. First and foremost, the Eudicots have 2 cotyledons in their embryo, not just one like the monocots. Furthermore, where monocots typically have trimerous flowers with 3 petals to a whorl, the Eudicots have 4 or 5 petals to a whorl, so the Eudicot flowers are a little more structurally complex. Where the monocots typically have straight, unbranching veins organized in clean, parallel rows in their leaves, the Eudicots have non-parallel veins that branch wildly in their leaves and flower petals. Eudicots are an extremely diverse group, with member species of all shapes and sizes, and with all manner of functions, uses, and economic value. Some of the most charismatic megaflora are Eudicots, including the apple trees with their delicious apple fruit, and maple trees with their sugar-rich sap that gets turned into the syrup that you put on your pancakes. There's also the mighty oak tree with its dense, heavy wood, and the macadamia tree, which produces the extremely nutritious and economically valuable macadamia nut. Beech, teak, and ash trees are also all Eudicots, as are ground-dwelling plants that produce really large fruits, like squash, cucumber, watermelon, cantaloupe, and pumpkin. The Eudicots also include plants with smaller fruits, like pears, peaches, plums, apricots, and figs, as well as the ground-dwelling shrubs and herbs that produce berries, like blackberries, raspberries, mulberries, strawberries, blueberries, cranberries, and many others. Eudicots include plants that we often use for their scents, their tastes, or their aromas, like roses, lilacs, jasmine, mint, rosemary, sage, lavender, sesame, honeysuckle, and basil. Eudicots include all of the potatoes, all the sweet potatoes, all the tomatoes, and all the chili peppers. Eudicots even include a number of plants used as recreational drugs, including the tobacco plant that produces the tobacco that gets smoked in cigarettes, and the cannabis plant that produces the buds that get smoked in blunts, bowls, and bongs. As you can see, the Eudicots are by far the largest group of Angiosperms, with the largest and most wildly diverse collection of different species and different traits. It should also be clearer now why Angiosperms are currently the most diverse and widespread group of plants on the planet. You might recall me talking earlier about how Angiosperms appeared and seemed to rapidly spread and take over, usurping the position of dominant tree away from the conifers. This raises a question. Why, exactly, were the flowering plants so successful? What about them gave them such an edge and made them so good at surviving and reproducing and spreading out to outcompete other species? Their most powerful trait is their most characteristic feature. It's the flower. Well, now the question becomes, what evolutionary function does the flower provide? Why was this quality so strongly selected for? It's because the flower hugely increased the reproductive efficiency of the angiosperms. You see, the flowers have the same basic reproductive structure as the gymnosperms. They have microsporangium in their anthers that create spores that become pollen grains, and they have an ovule that produces eggs. Just like the gymnosperms, the anther will degrade and release spores into the wind. The spores will divide to become the pollen grain gametophytes, and these will start to produce sperm when they come into contact with an ovule. Just like the gymnosperms, the ovary will produce a macrospore that divides by meiosis to turn into a megagametocyte, which then divides by mitosis to become an embryo. Inside of this embryo is an egg cell and 2 polar nuclei, as well as 3 antipodal cells and 2 synergid cells. So the angiosperms have the same basic method for reproduction as the gymnosperms. One individual will release pollen, which fertilizes the egg on another individual, and this fertilization produces a seed. It's the same basic strategy. The only difference is that the angiosperms surround their ovaries with attractive flowers. Imagine that you're a pollinator, like a bee or a fly. The enticing scents and the visual cues provided by the flower will attract you, and you'll find yourself landing on the flower and licking around for tasty nectar. You smell the nectar, and you think you see it deep inside this flower thing, and so you struggle to grab some. You extend your proboscis, and success! You get some nectar, and you're enjoying it. How good it tastes. But now, all of the nectar that you can easily slurp out of this one flower is gone, so you have to fly to another flower. You land, and you get excited about more nectar. You dig around for it, you slurp it up, and then you fly to another flower. Rinse and repeat, over and over again, all day, for basically every mature bee in the hive. What the bee, or you as the bee in this imaginary situation, might not have noticed is that as you landed on a flower and looked around for nectar, your little insect hairs were getting covered in pollen. When you flew from one flower to the next and moved around as you searched for more nectar, some of the pollen from that first plant is scraped or shaken off, and it falls into the flower of the second plant. You're also getting covered in even more pollen from the second plant, and as you fly from flower to flower throughout the day, from plant to plant, you end up shedding all of this pollen and all of these different flowers over what could be a huge area. And this is excellent for the angiosperms, because by doing this, they improve their reproductive success dramatically. Instead of relying on the wind, which at best is random and will randomly throw your spores at another plant, you as the bee, or you as the pollinator, are able to carry pollen directly from flower to flower, It's not just throwing your pollen into the wind and hoping for the best. It's actually extremely focused and highly efficient. Because the bee gets tasty nectar and the plant gets improved reproductive success, when everything goes smoothly, everyone in this mutualist relationship will benefit. The fitness advantages to this symbiosis are so strong that all manner of angiosperms, and even a number of gymnosperms, have evolved a dependence on these insects or other animals like moths, butterflies, or hummingbirds as pollinators. And many of the pollinators have, in turn, evolved a dependence on the plant's nectar as a food source. Pollinators like butterflies and hummingbirds are literally called fluid feeders because they feed exclusively off of the liquid nectar that their symbiotic plants are giving them. There's another factor that improved angiosperm fitness. In gymnosperms, the seed is grown out in the open. There isn't an ovary to protect the seeds as they develop. They're exposed to the elements, to the atmosphere, and to other animals. This is why some species of gymnosperms make cones, which are it's like an armored coating for the seed to protect it within this dry, hardened exterior shell. Angiosperms, on the other hand, grow their seeds inside an ovary, which fully encapsulates the seed. As the embryo matures, the parent tissue in the ovary grows into pericarp, or the fleshy tissue of a fruit. The fruit is parent tissue that fully wraps around the seed, which is offspring tissue. It might seem a little odd for a plant to invest all of this sugar into producing pericarp tissue, but the end result is actually worth it. It's definitely worth it. So, as you probably know, fruit is tasty. It tastes really good. And humans aren't the only species to realize how tasty fruit is either. Numerous primates eat fruit as a major part of their diet. So do many species of birds and reptiles, who are known to eat small berries and other little fruits whenever they find them. So by now, you might be piecing together how the fruit and its great taste plays into angiosperm fitness. Well, first, when an animal eats a fruit, it will often ingest the seeds. The seeds aren't harmed by going through the animal's digestive tract, and when the animal excretes the seed with their waste, the seeds are now in a great spot to germinate. Presumably, the animal covered some geographic distance between eating the fruit and pooping out the seeds, so the seed has been deposited far away from its parent plant. This is good because it helps the plant species spread out and colonize new areas. Second, the seeds are now sitting in a pile of poop, which is excellent fertilizer. It's full of decomposing organic tissue, which means it's just packed with bioavailable nutrients. In this way, the seed is given an extra comfortable starting position, which maximizes its chances at germinating and sprouting into a healthy plant. If an animal doesn't eat the fruit, if the fruit just falls off the tree and lands on the ground, well, it's not that far away, but the rotting fruit tissue will provide a similar little nutritional boost to help germination. Well, alright, I think that about wraps it up for today's episode on flowering plants, on the Angiosperms. I hope I was able to fire up the engines in your brain and get you really thinking and interested in the flowering plants. On that note, I hope you've been enjoying this whole series exploring the plant kingdom. There's one episode left, in which I'll be talking about the relationship between humans and plants. If you want to listen to all the ways that we use plants, be it for food, for textiles, for construction, or for medicinal or recreational drugs, if any of that sounds interesting to you, then be sure to subscribe and check it out. Give this episode a like, or if you're listening to it in iTunes, then go into the iTunes store and give it a good rating and leave a review. All of that stuff really helps the podcast. And as always, thanks for listening.